Welcome everyone to another exciting episode of the Average Ontario Anglers Fishing Podcast. We have a great episode for you this week, and I want to say it is on a subject that I love to do. Talk about it is, to me, there's not a whole lot to talk about. I mean, there is if you want to get into it, but we're not going to get too deep. This is going to be a good what to do for the basics for carp fishing. Now, springtime is a great time to do it. I know Jesse and I, we like it because you can get out for a couple hours after work, without taking a whole day off of work to go do fishing. So we're going to get into some of the basics on carp fishing, and we're going to deep dive into my little carp box as to what I bring carp fishing. But first, we're going to have an interesting fishing fact given by Jesse, and I've been told it's a historical one.
It is. We're actually going to go back in time today to the late 60s, 1960s. So I'm going to ask you this question, Andrew. Have you ever heard of the man named Larry Hopper?
I've heard of Larry the Lobster, but...
That's from SpongeBob, though. So Larry Hopper is a very important person in the fishing history of all the world. I was going to say like North America, but everywhere. This guy revolutionized one thing that I almost guarantee every angler uses today. What is that thing? Let's find out. Larry Hopper was actually, back in the day, was quite a hammer at bass fishing. He loved fishing. He lived on the west side of the United States in California, but in that area, he actually won many events, including the U.S. Open on Lake Mead back in 1987. So fair to say this guy was very good at fishing. Now, what most people don't know, you might look up this guy and be like, yeah, he was very accomplished angler. But what they don't know is this guy was actually instrumental in the development of the graphite fishing rod. Now, we're going to get into a little bit of history because this is pretty interesting. Guy was a beast of an angler, but he was a chemist for a composites company in California. So what this company did is they actually made a lot of stuff for the aerospace industry. Now, he's obviously very smart because you don't just get to be working in the aerospace industry if you're as dumb as a brick. So he was obviously very smart. So what they did, this company that he worked for, which was called Narmco Materials, they were basically an aerospace industry that supplied fiberglass materials and structural film adhesives for aerospace, like spacecraft and stuff like that. And, back in the 60s and stuff, they were building spacecrafts like crazy back then, apparently, to land on the moon.
The space race was still on. Yeah.
Yeah. So one day in the late 1960s, they joined with a British company, and this company introduced to them a new thing. It was called carbon fiber. Now, this was crazy. So at the time, their main focus was aerospace. That's what their deal was. That's what they made their money with. But at the same time, they had a bunch of other stuff that they made for other companies. They actually made pre-made fishing blank for Garcia, which we know as now Abu Garcia.
Yep.
So they would make fiberglass, like rod, blanks for this company. Fiberglass though, not graphite. So basically what they would do is they would weave unidirectional glass fibers and then impregnate them with resin. And then it would basically be wound onto a tapered mandrel, baked in an oven. And then they'd pull the mandrel out. And then what do you have? You have a hollow tube, which was fiberglass with resin, which was the standard at that time for fishing rods. Everyone back then fished fiberglass because that's all there was. Mm-hmm. It was terrible, but that's what they had. This Hopper guy, he basically said that the fishing industry wasn't their biggest customer. Compared to the aerospace stuff, fishing was very small on their list of things that they did. But for him, as we know, he was an avid angler. So not only was he in the aerospace job market there, but he was an angler. So you have to think, he's like making this material. He has this new material called carbon fiber, which was super brittle at the time. And then he has, we actually already make fiberglass fishing materials for companies. So you have to think the wheels are probably turning in his head. And he's just like, I wonder what I can do with this. So then in the late 60s, basically he started taking mechanical test reports of new materials of carbon fiber. Basically, he would test the modulus, the tensile strength, and specific strengths so that he basically could find out what properties that they could use to make certain things. Did he tell his boss that he was planning to make fishing rods? Probably not. He was like, oh man, this tube would look super cool on the spacecraft. And his boss is like, go for it. We can sell it for $10 million. I'm not going to get into the science of it because I don't even understand it. But he was basically saying in this article about all the tensile strength of, carbon fibers compared to other materials. And basically, from what I understand, he was saying that carbon fiber material is greater than 4 times lighter than steel and nearly 2 times stronger. So carbon fiber is 2 times stronger than steel and 4 times lighter. So I don't know if you knew this, you probably knew this, Andrew, but back in the day, there's actually rod manufacturers that used metal. Like rods were made completely of metal, which is insane.
I've still been trying to find one of those. I have a full like resin poured like fiberglass rod with a wooden handle, like a trolling rod. I'm still trying to find an old metal handle.
I just think that would be funny. They're always like, oh, if there's, a storm, you shouldn't have your rod in the water or in the air. It's like, well, it's a metal pole, so it's not the best thing to hold in your hand. I can't even imagine using, like I've picked up some fiberglass rods that were super heavy, but I can't imagine using like a steel fishing rod.
The only thing I could picture working would be like a titanium and magnesium kind of steel. Like they're so light, but I'm sure those rods they used back then were not titanium or magnesium.
They were just like tent poles.
Like, and the tip is bendy because it made it out of lead. It's like
every time you set the hook, the rod just stays at that angle and you have to bend it back after. So anyway, this guy is working on materials as he's doing the fishing thing. So Larry, with a name like Larry, it doesn't really sound like an aerospace guy. You think his name would be like something more sophisticated? I don't know. No offense if your name is Larry. It just sounds like Larry is like a tow truck driver. I don't know.
Hey, Larry, how we doing on that composite for that space thing?
Yeah. So anyway, they're working on materials to make this new graphite, basically, for fishing rods. Now, you have to think, was this an easy thing to do? Well, they had created things that would have worked, but unfortunately, they're using aerospace products to build it. So you have to think, they could build a rod that was made of this cool material that was super light and the resins, but it was using materials that they normally use to make spacecraft. So it wasn't cheap. So I always said, Andrew, there's probably a lot of things now that are possible, but they just don't happen because they're way too expensive to produce and actually sell. So that was the case with this. They basically had these things that they were looking at. Oh, this would make a cool fishing rod, but unfortunately, these would cost $9,000 each. So it just wasn't possible. So his boss basically, he said, due to the high cost of this matrix resin that they used to use on spacecraft, he said, we need you to figure out a different resin, like a commercial grade resin that was significantly cheaper. Like it has to be very cheap compared to the aerospace resin because it was super expensive to make. So he took that as a challenge. And basically, long story short, he formulated the first matrix resins to make carbon fiber blanks for the fishing industry. And that resin became the standard for decades. And he created this thing that was so good, even back in the day, that it was used for decades and decades and decades until they improved it. Not only did they make fishing stuff, they also got into golf stuff too, because that became very popular. So you have to think, what brand, I know you probably know this, Andrew, but listeners listening, what brand do you think was one of the first brands, actually the first brand, to accept this graphite material?
If I had to say a guess, it would be Shimano, maybe.
Remember, this is back in the 70s.
Yeah. I wasn't sure Shimano, because I know Shimano has like their fingers in a lot of other, like they were working on bike parts and stuff like that too, right? And they still do. So I wasn't sure maybe them, or being back that old.
I don't know if Shimano actually made rods back in the 70s. But so what he did is they took this product, and he belonged to a bass club in Southern California. It was actually called the Saddleback Bassmasters. So he basically had one of his buddies that was in his bass club. His name was Dave Myers, and he worked at Fenwick. Now, we know Fenwick has been making rods for decades and decades. Actually, they're the first rod manufacturer to take on this. In fact, the Fenwick HMG stands for high modulus graphite. That was one of the first graphite rods. So back in the day, Fenwick used to be like, now it's kind of like a company that's owned by a huger company. But back then, Fenwick was the deal. It was like the best rod you could buy was Fenwick. Everyone had that. That's what everyone wanted. So basically what they did is they took the material, they rolled the first blanks with it. And then in 1972, they came out with the graphite rod that was carbon fiber. And it was available on the shelves in the fishing store. They commercialized it. And then basically it became so good that all these other brands at the time, again, this is in the mid 70s, they had Lamiglass, which is out on the West Coast. That's more of a salmon steelhead kind of brand. G. Loomis. Yeah. Gary Loomis was all over that. Yep. He was actually one of the first ones to like get it very good.
Yeah.
The guy's a genius. St. Croix and a bunch of other brands, which are not even in business anymore, they all jumped on it. And basically after that, fiberglass was like, it still has its purpose in some things, but after that, if you hold them side by side, you'd be like, wow, this rod weighs half of what this rod weighs. And it's so sensitive. If this rod just came out and you were just skeptical, you're like, oh, what is this thing? Because like your whole life and your whole, family history, your dad and your grandpa, they all used fiberglass fishing rods. And out comes this newfangled carbon fiber material. It's super lightweight. Would you have jumped on the bandwagon?
I would probably, honestly, I would have picked one up and felt to me like, why is it so stiff? And like, even then they had like mod fast graphite. Like it was not like what we have now, like crisp rods. Yeah. Like, why is it so stiff? I'm like, oh, look, you can just break the tip by bending it. I probably wouldn't have, because it's new, it's gimmicky. The fiberglass has been catching me fish my whole life. I probably would have avoided it for quite a while.
Yeah. For sure. I just think it's funny. The article kind of ends it saying that this guy just happened to be the right guy working at the right company with the right hobby to make the graphite fishing rod. I'm sure someone else, if this guy hadn't existed, someone else would have done it eventually. But imagine this guy that just happens to work in the aerospace industry and have all this material and this R&D department to build the first, carbon fiber resin to make fishing rods. Just happened to be like a hammer at bass fishing. He's like, oh yeah. So he's the father of the graphite rod. But I just think it's funny that imagine the first few bass tournaments and guys are rolling out there with graphite rods for the first time in history. And they're dragging jigs on the bottom. They're actually feeling bites and they're just destroying in the tournaments. Like all these guys are like, here's the thing. I have a bunch of ugly sticks. Those are fiberglass. Nice rods. You can cast a spoon all day, spinners with them, no problem. I do not want to drag stuff on the bottom and feel bites with them. They're not sensitive rods at all. Mm-hmm. If you pick up a graphite rod, just imagine these guys that are just slaying in the tournaments. And everyone's like, what's your secret? You're like, carbon fiber.
Yeah. Like think of how many techniques just wouldn't exist now if it wasn't for sensitive rods. Like most techniques that have come out in the past, I mean, crankbaits have been around for forever. Top waters, you see the strike. Jigs, the jig's been around for a long time, but we fish them differently now. And if we never had the capability of, you can feel the difference and you can feel it when it's hitting bottom or whatever. Yeah, most of these techniques just wouldn't be around.
Exactly. And then think even further, like graphite rods come out. And again, they got better and better as years go on. They got more sensitive. And then braided fishing line comes out. And they're just like, oh, I can feel everything. So anyway, that was the interesting fishing fact. So if you ever wondered when the first graphite rods came out, now you know. And maybe next time you're in the fishing store, you can go and look at a good old Fenwick and be like, good on you guys for starting the revolution, the graphite revolution.
The 60s were a time of, putting space age technology into everything too, right? like acrylic chairs in the 60s and 70s, they looked cool. But what I was thinking actually when you said that, because that factory or whatever, doing the testing on the carbon fiber on the graphite for space, engineering, it made me think of those videos where they talk about the guy from NASA and he's like, this bag of washers, and it looks like a bag of 10-cent washers, right? And he's like, this bag cost you $190,000, whatever it was. It's ridiculous for just washers to use on a spacecraft. And I'm wondering, what if those original rods, maybe they had something very similar that they used for like tensile support on the exterior and the interior or something of the spacecraft. And he just took that same part and he's like, yeah, we, instead of charging them thousands of dollars for this, let's sell it as a $50 rod.
Yeah. Just put some guides on it. Perfect.
Yeah. NASA's like, no, we could have just gone to Bass Pro. That's clever. I like that. I like learning new things. So a historical fishing fact that is definitely interesting and lives up to its name is always good. Well done, Jesse.
Thank you.
Now to get into our boring topic. I'm just kidding. It's great. So when I say carp fishing, I wonder what our listeners are thinking.
Corn.
Oh. Wrong corn.
Okay. I mean peaches and cream.
Yeah, exactly. Canned sweet corn, creamed corn, tasty. But for me growing up, when I saw carp, and I would kind of laugh at the articles in Fisherman or Ontario Outdoors magazines or something like that, or Fish in Canada. I would look at these carp articles and I'm like, those are ugly fish. why are people showing off them catching these fish? It's not that exciting. I read one article and it's talking about boilies, and it's like how to make your own boilies. I'm like, this looks stupid. Why would I want to do this? And it wasn't until I actually went out there and Jesse's like, hey, we should go for carp. And that was a number of years ago. And I caught my first couple carp, and they were up in a creek up north, and it was a blast. I'm like, these are fun to catch.
Yeah, they are.
So if any of you haven't gone carp fishing, or you've kind of looked down on it as, it's a garbage fish or whatever, I ask that you try, because we're going to go over what is needed to target carp. It may surprise you that if you are a fisherman who has, gone for, any other species, this is probably one of the cheapest specialty fishing species you can go for.
Yeah.
Muskie, you talk about getting a muskie rod. A lot of times it costs a lot of money to get a muskie reel. They can cost a lot of money. And then musky lures themselves are between $40 and $100 a lure. Like, that's a lot to get into musky fishing. And then there's the access. There's not a lot of places you can catch muskie from shore. There are some, but there's not a lot. So if you wanted to actually give it a go and try it, it can be hard. With carp fishing, it's easy. And it's so easy that the entirety of my carp equipment, besides I have a couple rods now, I actually only have one carp rod. My other rod is my salmon shore casting rod, but I'll use that for carp fishing. But the entirety of my carp tackle box is this small cardboard box. This is what literally joins me creekside and lakeside when I go for carp. That's all it is. So we're going to be going into a little bit of what's needed to be able to effectively target carp. And like I said, for anyone who hasn't done it, you're going to learn that it's not that hard. And for almost pennies in the dollar, you can get into a whole new species of fish. So what would you say, Jesse, would be the first thing that, besides corn, we'll get into that in a bit, but what would be, tackle-wise, the most important thing if you're going to go out targeting carp?
Well, again, like you said, you don't need anything specialized to do this. You definitely can. Like any hobby, you can go, you can go into the depths. Like there's guys that all they do is carp fish, and they have all this expensive fancy gear, and that's their thing. That's totally cool. We're not like that. At the same time, we're kind of in the middle. We don't just use basic gear. We do have some slightly specialized gear, but we're not gurus out there. But you need to have proper equipment. You can't use just anything to catch them. You can, but you shouldn't, because the reason is they are huge fish. Generally, I'd say the average carp is between 10 and 20 pounds, the average carp. So you don't want to be using like an ultralight trout rod or panfish rod. So I'd say like the first thing you want to do is look at your rod and be like, can this handle a 10 to 20 pound fish? Like maturely, like you don't want to be fighting a fish to death, right?
Yeah. And well, another thing too is carp, like they look like giant beach balls swimming around with giant scales. They're goldfish. And you picture a goldfish in a tank and it's just, it's frilly fins and it's just kind of wobbling its way through the water. Like carp aren't like that. They can turn into rockets. Like they're not as fast as a steelhead or a salmon. No. But if it starts wanting to go in a direction,
they're bulldozers.
With carp gear, you have a hard time changing that direction. It will just go where it wants. You don't want to be there severely underpowered.
Yeah. I know we'll probably get more into like specific tackle, but you want to have a rod and a reel that can handle carp fishing. It doesn't have to be expensive. For years, we used very, very inexpensive reels. You just need a slightly bigger reel that holds a decent amount of line. You can use braided line. We'll get into this a little bit later. You can use braided line. You can use monofilament. It depends where you're fishing. You don't need anything fancy. You just need to have a rod and a reel that's beefy. I'll say that. It has to be beefy.
Yeah. So let's say you have an extra heavy bass rod. That'll work. Let's say you cast for shore salmon. That'll work.
Yeah.
It'll get the job done. It's not going to be best suited, but it'll get the job done. The next thing that I would say, if you own something like that, and we can go into some other options again in a bit, what you have to buy next essentially would be I can narrow it down to three things. Good carp hooks, which again, a pack of these might run you, maybe $5-7, maybe $10 if you get really fancy ones. But they help a lot because they're the right size, deadly sharp, and they're strong enough to not bend out on a carp. And then you get yourself some big old sinkers. You can get carp weights, which cost a little bit more. They have some advantages. If you want to go the even cheaper route, maybe even have some big old lead sinkers. That can work as well. Once you get that, buy yourself a can of corn, and you could start carp fishing. May not be the best suited for it, but you can go out there and have some fun. Absolutely. I know we were fishing with a guy, like we'll get into rigs as well. It's kind of the next point of if you wanted to go a little step further, which doesn't cost a whole lot either, is to tie yourself up some hair rigs. But we were fishing with a guy. He kept fishing and he was just putting corn right in the hook. And here we are with our hair rigs, and he's out fishing us like 2-1. And it doesn't mean you need to have specialty rigs all the time. Sometimes the way carp are feeding, a single one comes in and like just corn on the hook works really, really well. But one of the things that I have is I got this old leader wallet, rig wallet in an old tackle box, which I now put my hair rigs on. So a hair rig is a really cool piece of equipment, which again, we just tie our own. You can buy them pre-tied, but it's not a whole lot to tie your own.
So like you said, you can easily, and it's very popular, catch carp on a regular hook. You can catch carp on a circle hook. We'll get into this after, but a hair rig is more of a specialized rig. So it's usually a piece of braided line. They use braid because it's more limp and it feels more natural when the fish sucks it in. But it's basically like a kind of like a snell knot that goes around the hook, and then there's a tag end that hangs off the back of the hook. And then onto that piece that's hanging off like a little tail on the end of the hook, you attach a few pieces of corn. It could be 2 pieces, it could be 8 pieces, it could be a boilie, which is a little ball of bait. It could be a lot of things. So basically the premise behind how a hair rig works is because carp have very sensitive mouths. They're going to suck food off the bottom and then they will exhale the rest back out. So the hook, when they come up to your bait, oftentimes they will suck it into their mouth. And if they feel a hook or something, they try to spit it out immediately. So if you're using sometimes just a hook with corn on it, sometimes they'll suck it in and spit it out a few times and not get hooked at all. So the thing about a hair rig is because the hook is completely void of bait, the bait is on a piece of line underneath the hook. When they suck that bait into their mouth and then they expel the water back out, that hook is in the perfect position to prick them right in the bottom of the lip or in the lip. So when that happens, usually they bolt or they just swim off quick and they get hooked. So having that hook completely exposed as they're sucking it in and spitting it out, it gives you a much higher percentage chance of actually hooking them. And most carp anglers will have some kind of a hair rig usually. Again, you can catch them on a bare hook. I've even caught them on a circle hook. I'd mention that too. We'll talk about a bolt rig. There's a few different rigs, but this is the favorite way that me and Andrew like to catch them. It's called a bolt rig. So you'll have a carp weight, which I have right here, which is about, generally when you're using a bolt rig, you're going to look at least 2 ounces minimum. It could be way higher than that, but what we generally stay at is around the 2.5 to 3 ounce range. Sounds pretty heavy, but what you want this to do is pin down into the mud. And when a fish gets that prick of the hook when it's sucking your bait in, what they do is they bolt. They get spooked. They just feel like a little prick in their mouth and they just shoot. And what happens is you have this 3 ounce weight that basically just pulls the hook into their mouth. So you don't have to set the hook, nothing like that. You can cast your bait really far. And one good thing about the bolt rig is you can launch your bait as far as you can. And you might think, I can't even see where that landed. There's no way I'm going to be able to set the hook. You don't have to set the hook. This big heavy sinker is going to pull the hook. Like Andrew said, they're sharp hooks right into its mouth. That is called the bolt rig. That is very effective. You can also use the bolt rig with a circle hook. Now, if you don't know what a circle hook is, why don't you explain that, Andrew?
So a circle hook, if you're just picturing a regular fish hook, what I want you to do is bend that tip, the hook tip, bend it right in, almost at a 45 or almost 90-degree angle sometimes. And what that does is if you would just covered your hand over that hook and pulled, there's a good chance it may just like pop out of your hand. How it's designed is when that line is coming out of that fish's mouth, nice and slowly, you don't set the hook with circle hooks. You just reel in the slack. And what will happen is that hook will come in and with that bent tip, it hooks into the edge of the lip as it's exiting the fish's mouth and just then turns and penetrates the hook point. Now, once there's pressure on it, the rest of the hook just embeds in and you're good to go. But that's another hook that you don't need to set the hook with. You just need to start applying gradual pressure and it will hook itself essentially.
Yeah. And it always hooks them around the corner of the lip. They're not just for carp fishing. A lot of guys use them saltwater fishing. And I've actually used them for bass fishing as well. It's a great technique. Like you said, though, you don't set the hook. You just have some steady pressure, work the hook out of their mouth, and then it wraps around their lip and they're hooked. And it locks in. Like it's not coming off. And the cool thing is with a bolt rig, they work great. I did this actually with my nephew because we went out carp fishing and the bite was kind of slow. And I snagged on something and I was like, you know what? I don't have any hair rigs left. So I just tied on a circle hook. I loaded it with corn. The whole hook was covered with corn. And I had a 3 ounce bolt rig. I whipped it out, along the shore. It sat down. We caught 4 carp in like half an hour in the thing. No hook set required. My nephew was like 9 or 10 at the time. The reel would just start screaming. He'd pick up the reel it in, and then have a fish on, which is great for beginners because you don't have to, many like times that you take up beginner fishing and or someone that's not super experienced and you're like, set the hook, and they're like, what? How do you do that? And they're like, pull back really hard. You don't have to worry about that. Even for someone like me, it's great not to have to run to the rods and have to set the hook. Fish is already hooked. You don't have to worry about it. So that's generally what me and Andrew do. We like to use hair rigs. Sometimes we'll use circle hooks. Sometimes just a bare hook. I find when you use the bare hook, usually that's when I'm using just like 2 small kernels of corn, because carp, I wouldn't say they're overly picky, but sometimes they are. And sometimes they don't want a big, like a big spread of corn on a hook. They want literally like 1 kernel with a small little hook. And that's all they'll take because they're keyed in on eating a certain thing or a certain size. And that's what they want. That's the time when I'll go to that. And then what I'll do in that circumstance, I won't use a bolt rig. I'll just use a slip sinker, like an egg sinker with a split shot, so that when the fish grabs the corn and starts eating it and starts swimming away, it doesn't feel any pressure from the sinker dragging. It's
just line passing through.
Yeah. But the only thing with that technique is you have to really watch your line and watch your rod. But usually I watch the line. So you have some slack, like kind of, hanging down to the water, and all of a sudden your line will just tighten up and then start moving. And then you have to run to your rod and set the hook because they'll drop the bait. So it requires more focus. And sometimes, like Andrew said, we're just going out after work. We're trying to relax. We don't want to focus. We literally just want to, relax. So that's one technique.
And the next thing that I would recommend getting after, we covered the bare minimum, and we're going to go into a bit more of now what I would recommend getting at this point. Let's say you've caught your first carp and you're like, you know what? That was fun. I had a couple kernels of corn on a hook. I caught it on my old bass gear. What should I buy next? Yeah. The first thing I would say is get a rod. Get a rod and a bait feeder reel, because that just enhances the whole experience way more. Those are the probably the biggest ticket items you're going to have to buy. But again, they don't have to be the crazy high-end ones shipped over from, England, because that's where the big carp guys are. Like, you don't have to do that. There are some really budget carp options. And again, your rod for carp fishing, you're not casting and retrieving. You're not doing a Ned rig. You're not, trying to feel those light bites, and you aren't touching your rod. So sensitivity doesn't enter it. You don't need to worry about that. You need a rod that can take your casting a 2, 3, 4 ounces of gear tackle out into the water, potentially at long distance. That's what you want the rod for. And then you also want a rod that has backbone to fight a fish. So that's the 2 things that you're going to look for a carp rod. And there are some great budget options. You can pick them up for like $80 to $150, some of these budget carp rods. And they are well suited to have you get a very enjoyable time out in the water going for carp. And then the other thing I'd recommend is a bait feeder reel. Now, bait feeder is essentially you want a reel that has 2 drag systems. So I think bait feeder is actually a trademarked expression, like Senko is for stick baits.
No, it's actually bait runner is trademarked.
Oh, bait runner. So Jesse has on screen here a bait feeder reel. And why don't you explain how that system works?
So essentially what Andrew said is a bait runner or a bait feeder reel. It has 2 drags. So the cool thing about that is this is a regular spinning reel. It has a drag on the front, on the top, where regular spinning reel's drag is. That's the fighting drag. We're going to call that the fighting drag. On the bottom here, there's a switch. You can click it down just like that. And when you do that, it basically lets the spool spin. Like it basically becomes a secondary drag, but it's very light. And the reason for that is when you hook a carp, I've learned this the hard way. If you don't have a bait feeder reel or a reel when you loosen the drag, like a big pit reel, when a carp grabs your bait, like I said, they bolt. And they are not slow, they're fast. They will pull your whole rod in the water easily. I've seen it happen. It's happened to me almost so many times, where all of a sudden you'll have your rod between a forked stick, your line just tightens up, and all of a sudden your rod's like, and it falls in the water. These carp just go.
They feel the resistance as the line tightens, and they're off like a shot.
Yeah. And you don't want to lose your rod and reel. You don't want to do that. So basically with a bait feeder reel, your fighting drag is still at an appropriate strength for when you're actually fighting the fish. But the free spool drag at the bottom, it's adjustable too, so you can change the tension. It basically, when a carp goes and smashes your bait and goes for a run, it just lets the line come off. Not super easy, but it lets it come off enough that your rod isn't going to fly into the water. And then what happens is when you turn the handle, that free spool drag on the back clicks off, and then you're back onto the fighting drag on the top. So you can actually fight the fish. Now, my favorite thing about that, except for the fact that obviously you're not, having to dive in after your rod so many times. Before me and Andrew got bait feeding reels, carp fishing was more of a stressful thing for us because we'd be trying to relax and just, enjoy the evening. But you'd be always paranoid just looking at your rod. It's like, oh, do I have a bite? Oh, get ready to dive. You see so many guys just dive for the rod. So at least when you get a bait feeder reel or a reel like that has a secondary drag that is very loose, you don't have to worry about that. You can relax because when a fish runs, you'll just hear the drag. Zzz, you hear that noise and then you're like, oh, I got a fish. And you run to your rod, turn the handle, and boom, you're fighting the fish instantly. So you don't have that stress of always having to look over at your rod every 2 seconds. Especially, it always happens when you take a pee, right?
Of course. And like you say, there are other ways that it can be done. Like I said, you could cast out, and you have to remember every single time, loosen your drag pretty much all the way. But then when you pick up your rod and you go to set the hook or fight the fish, you have to tighten your drag back up and not over tighten it, not keep it under tight. So it can be done. Another way that I've done it before is you can actually leave your bail open on a spinning reel, let's say, and I'll place a smooth rock just on top of my line. Yeah. On the ground or on another pedestal, whatever it is. So that way, the wind isn't blowing the line out, but as soon as something actually starts pulling on the line, it slips out from underneath that rock and will start coming off that spool. Yeah. But again, you have to keep your eye out because if you're not paying attention at all, it makes no noise when that's happening.
Yeah.
So with a bait runner, a bait feeder reel, what you have is an audible drag noise. So you'll hear hey, I'm here, the clicking, something's happening. And again, it's worry-free, like Jesse said.
I was just going to talk a little bit about rods quick because we kind of went to the reels. For the reels, if you're looking to use a regular spinning reel, I would recommend a minimum of a 4,000, just a regular spinning reel, the same reel that you'd use for salmon. That would be more for short distance fishing. You're not going to be able to launch a 3-ounce sinker with a regular salmon rod with that, or it's very difficult. So I'd recommend at least a 4,000. If you are getting a bait runner or a bait feeder style reel with dual drags, I'd recommend at least a 4,000. But honestly, I'd probably go up to a 5,000 or 6,000. I run a 6,000. I also have an 8,000, which sounds like overkill. It's not. Some of these carp reels you see the guys have, they're huge. They're 10,000 size. But for overall, a 6,000 is my favorite size because it's big enough that it holds a lot of line that you can make a really long cast. It also picks up a lot of line when you're reeling in. Sometimes they rush towards you. 8,000, I got the 8,000 bait runner from Shimano just because it's also my double duty saltwater. It's a saltwater rated reel. It's a saltwater reel. It's not designed for carp fishing at all. Just carp guys kind of jumped on it, right? But I use that when I go saltwater fishing the odd time when I'm down in South Carolina. But 6,000 I'd recommend. But for years, I think we ran very budget friendly Okumas that were in the 4,000 size. 5,000 is perfect. And you can get a decent bait feeder reel for $75, $80, $100. And again, you get what you pay for. That reel might not last you 10 years, but it's going to get the job done. Like Andrew said, you're not casting and retrieving constantly. It's just cast out and let it sit there. You might only cast, 10 times every night. So you don't need to get a super high end reel. And then for rods, if you have regular bass gear, that's fine. You can catch them on a 7-foot medium spinning rod. You can 100%. If you want to get more specialized to fish bigger, bolt rigs, like we were saying, you're going to need to have a minimum of a medium heavy salmon rod. Me and Andrew have been using 8.5 to 10.5 foot medium heavy spinning rods that are salmon rods for many years. And when we got carp rods, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, carp rods are rated differently because they're the English style. So they actually rate them in pound curves, test curves. So you'll look at a carp rod and it'll say 3-pound test curve. You're like, what the heck does that mean? Basically, from my understanding, it means you can hang 3 pounds of weight off the rod before it goes to 90 degrees. So obviously, the higher the test curve, the stronger the rod. In Ontario, for what we normally do, we're not chucking 5-ounce weights. Most carp rods are going to be between 2.5, 2.75, or 3 pound. My favorite is 2.75. 2.75 test curve. That's what me and Andrew both have. You can easily cast weight 3-4 ounces. If you're checking bigger than that, I'd go up to 3. I also have a 3-pound test curve rod. It's a little stiffer, but you can definitely whip a bigger weight farther. And if you're fishing in a big lake where you have to cast really far, you might want to get that. Another thing is rod length. If you are actually buying a carp rod, we have some carp rods that are 9 foot long. They're shorter rods because we fish a lot of smaller areas. You don't need a 12 or 13 foot rod for that. 9-foot rod is good if you're fishing small areas like little creeks, ponds, or like river mouths. But if you are casting long distances, a lot of people go, 10 and a half, 11, 12, 13-foot rods. They even have like 15-foot carp rods. Don't need that. I would just get anywhere between a 9-foot and 11-foot and you'll be fine. So that's my little rant on carp gear. Also, like, I find that back even like 5 years ago, buying carp stuff was a lot harder. Like, we ordered a lot of our stuff offline, like at carpkit.com. But now you can go to sale. Like, you can literally walk into sale and they have a bunch of different carp rods, like right on the shelf. Daiwa, the Daiwa Mad Dragon, I think that's a pretty reasonable carp rod. I think they're like $75.
Yeah,
actually, sale's not bad.
Hooks.
Yeah, I'll tell you, sale got a lot of carp stuff recently. They have rods, reels, the line you'd need. They have a whole little shelf with all the hooks, plastic corn. They actually have like those like little jars with the jumbo corn. We like those. Yeah, I always find them at sale. Yeah, like the jumbo. We're gonna get into that, but like the jumbo corn, the tiger nuts, all the little like prepared bait. They also have sale. Also has like what is that stuff called? Like the stuff that you put into the mesh, like the feeder, like pellets.
Oh yeah. The method feeders.
Yeah. So like all the stuff you need, you can probably find it at your local fishing store. Like, we always go to sale and just pick up the stuff because they have pretty much everything that we need. Again, we're not super bougie, so we're not looking for specialty products, but yeah. So
the next thing that I would say, and again, at this point, you've got your rod. If you want to use a hair rig, the thing you're going to need is some carp tools. You might think, I got to buy tools. Tools are expensive. They don't have to be. I'm going to show you what I use, and they are very budget friendly. I have a pair of braid scissors to cut line, trim that. And when I'm tying the hair rigs with braid, they're handy to use an actual pair of braid scissors. You can pick these up, again, online at your local tackle store, wherever. They're in a bucket at the front by the cache. Like, they're not expensive. Yeah. And the other thing is, Jesse and I both have the same kit. So it comes with, like 5 different tools, and I pretty much only use this one. They have a few different things. This is kind of to hold on to the hook when you're tightening it. When you're tying a hair rigs, it can come in handy because if you're using your fingers on those hooks and you go to tighten that knot, you're going to be embedding that hook straight into your finger. Yeah, don't do that. They have a little drill for if you're using boilies, which is a different type of bait. It's kind of like dough, but hard dough. And so you're going to drill a hole through it. Otherwise, it'll just crumble in bits if you just try and shove a rod through. So you drill the hole, and then you can put your applicator, what would it called? Is it applicator or a bait hook? I'm not sure. These ones here, they're really nice. They have a little hinge point on it, but essentially it's a small wire with a hook on the end. And what you do is you feed your corn or your boilies onto this little tool, and then on your hair rig, what you have is you have a loop. That line that comes off the bottom of that hook, you have a little loop. So once you put on your 3-4 pieces of corn, maybe a piece of floating corn, I like to use that, some jelly corn, whatever you're putting on, your tiger nuts, not made with real tigers, by the way. I was disappointed too. I know. So you hook that little hook into the loop at the bottom of that hair rig, and then slide all your bait onto that little hair that's coming off the back of your hook. Then you have these little yellow stoppers that you put on at the bottom, and it just slips that through that loop, and they'll hold it all on. So it doesn't just slip off of that, loop at the bottom of your line. Yeah. But basically, I'll say you can't do that without this little tool. You're not breaking the bank. I think I got this kit for $17. Even if you have to buy that, let's say the little hinge and stuff breaks on it, doesn't matter. Just keep using it until that hook busts off. Then maybe get a new one. But again, I've had this one for a few years now, and it's been working me fine.
Yeah, it's essentially like a baiting needle.
That's what I was trying to think of. So a bait needle. You could also use a bait needle if you have one. But yeah, these little tools are super handy and efficient for doing that. For corn, I often will go carp fishing with just a can of sweet corn. I'll bring 1 or 2 cans with me. So also my tools, I have a can opener. So I have, it's actually just an old Victorinox, and I have the can opener on the side of it. So I have that to be able to use to open those cans of sweet corn. That's what I chum the area with. Sometimes I'll use it as bait, but like Jesse says, another thing for bait, this is actually our favorite one. This smells amazing. It's the Tutti Frutti smell.
I love that one. It smells good.
Oh, I want to try it, but I know I shouldn't.
It
The
literally
great
says
thing,
on the can, not for human consumption.
that's also why I love the sweet cans of sweet corn, because you buy them in a grocery store and they are for human consumption. So if you get
Yeah,
a little snacky, you just scoop them in. Oh,
that's
delicious.
totally fine. You can eat it. It's great for you. It's nutritious. It's delicious. It's good for me.
Some guys, you can make your own, corn if you want to throw it out. Some guys will mix in bird seed and they mix in different things and some Jello mix and they put on all kinds of cool stuff to make their own little corn. Is it necessary? No, you don't have to. So again, if you're just starting out and you don't feel like going out and buying a 40-pound bag of feed corn that you got to boil and prep the day before you go carp fishing, that's fine. Go to Walmart, buy that $1 can of sweet corn and just chuck some of that out where you're fishing.
Yeah, I will say though, I bought a huge sack of feed corn a few years ago, and I still have half of it because it expands like triple the size once you boil it. So you make a whole pot of that, and I know the price probably went up, but I forget how much I paid. $20 for 40 pounds of corn, and then it triples in size. So you have like more than 100 pounds of corn. And then what I do is I boil up like during carp season when we were just gung ho going maybe 2 or 3 times a week. I'd boil up a whole pot worth, and then I would just like put it into a bucket and then just like leave it at the fridge at work just because there was a lot of space in there, and I'd just leave it in there. And that corn will be good for weeks if you keep it refrigerated, and you can just go out. And it comes down to the fact that instead of buying 1 can of corn, which you might go through, 2 or 3 cans of those in a night, you have this huge bucket, which only costs you $2. So if you're going to do carp fishing a lot, it may be worth it to you to buy a big bag of feed corn and boil it up yourself. But if not, and you just want to go, the cool thing about having a can of corn, you can throw a bunch in your trunk and be like, hey, I feel like carp fishing tonight. Bait's already in the trunk. Don't have to worry about it. Just grab a can and go.
Yeah. And another thing too for us, what we don't think about a lot is for the feeding area where we go most of the time, we can literally just throw out. We're casting 15 feet from shore to access the feeding ground that we're fishing these carp on. And so some guys, they'll feed an area for, every day for like weeks going in, unlike hunters where not allowed to, feed, leave apples and stuff like that, where they're going to be hunting those deer or where you can't feed the animal you're trying to hunt. You can with carp fishing. So you can prep this area, and even while you're fishing, you keep chumming it out with this corn, with this mix, whatever you're preparing. And you can essentially, these carp will learn to come to that area and to feed there. So you can actually draw them in. Let's say they're not there, you don't see them all the time, but they're in the area. Eventually they'll pick up on that. If you are regular with putting food out there for them, they'll come. If you feed it, they will come.
Yeah.
But
and I remember
there are special tools too for doing so. Sometimes there's a scoop on a stick. So you put your feet in there and then you can launch it. I can throw maybe 15, 20 feet loose corn. With that scoop, you could fire that 30 to 40. Then you have things like a spod bomb, I think they're called. Spod rocket.
Yeah.
And
which is very cool.
It looks like a big, or a short, fat rocket. It looks like an H-bomb. And what you do is you fill it with corn and you cast it out, and this thing just launches as far as you can cast it, which is like 120 feet, let's say. And that drops in the water, and as soon as it hits the water, it floats up and it opens and dumps all that corn or all that feed, whatever it is, into the water. So there's that option for getting it out there. There's slingshots, which if you like doing that, you get this big, like basically a sock full of corn on your slingshot and you fire it out there. And again, get it out way further. There's lots of kind of fun ways. Some guys, they'll take a canoe if they can, and they'll paddle over a kayak and they'll paddle out and just dump a bucket out there. If you want to get real fancy, they even have remote controlled boats that have like depth charges that they just release in the bottom, and you motor it out there and it's like open loading bay 2 and it dumps out all this corn. So there's lots of cool ways to get the area where you're fishing baited up. But again, there's a lot of places where we go that we have fish that we fish regularly, where all we do is we just ruin our shoulder by chucking out corn by hand. And it's possible.
Yeah. If you're in an area where carp, that there's carp there and you can see them there, you don't really have to attract them to the area. They're already there. Mm-hmm. So by throwing out or launching out corn into the area that you're going to fish, it's just going to get them feeding in that area. if you're fishing an area where maybe it's like a big bay or like the mouth of some lake, that there are carp there, but you don't see any. If you chum the area for several days in a row, eventually the carp are gonna, one will swim by and be like, oh, there's food here, and then he'll come back, another one will come. Eventually they come at around the same time. They'll get used to it. If you go like several days in a row, and then maybe like the fourth day you go there probably will be carp in that area just waiting for the corn. They're actually very intelligent fish. We think that they're dumb, but they're not. So again, if maybe like on the way home from work, there's a spot that you're like, you know what? I know there's carp in this pond or this area. I'm going to just stop, throw out a can of corn, and then just drive home. And the next day, stop, throw out a can of corn, and do that a few days in a row. By the time you go fishing, it'll be well worth your time stopping and chumming. But again, if you know that there's carp in the area and you can see them, then you might not have to worry about pre-chumming so much.
And then the last couple of things that I mentioned, because that kind of gets us, you've gone over all the gear. Again, this is kind of to start out. There's a lot of stuff you can get into. You can get higher end gear. You can get fancy stuff. But that kind of covers what we use when we're fishing there. The next thing, which is always I love the segment on Fish in Canada show. It's like, and now for getting there. So when carp fishing, a lot of the time, it's pretty rare when you can just park your car and you're right there. There are spots like that, which are fantastic. But sometimes you got to go for a little walk. And it's nice because then when you are fishing there, you're alone, you get to enjoy nature and whatnot. So on places like that, one of the biggest things that I like to bring is definitely bring a wagon. You can pick them up for, $50. You can get a nice one for $90, $100. Costco has them on sale a few times, and those are heavy duty. They hold up to 300 pounds. I've got one of those. The thing is awesome.
Well worth the money. Well worth it.
And you can use it for anything you want after that too. It's not just for carp fishing, although mine is. But I get that, a couple camp chairs, you have your rods that sit in there, and you can bring an extra jacket. You can bring some a flat of coffees with you, or some snacks, some food, whatever you want. Make sure you pack it out with you. But when you have the wagon, you can bring whatever gear you want to bring. Another thing that we haven't mentioned yet is a net. If you have a carp net, we like ones that are very rubberized, because carp fins, they can very easily split, and like any fish out there. But if you're using those old twine nets kind of thing with that green string, that's just going to shred carp. And as much as you may think of carp as kind of a garbage fish, carp anglers look at these fish as the most beautiful, most impressive fish that you have to protect. And they may sound odd to some people, but these guys, they have special mats. When they take it out, they have it on this cushioned mat, so it's not laying on the ground. They have needle and threads. They can suture up any wounds from when they caught it. They have iodine to like wash out any wounds so it doesn't get infected. All these things. Like, these guys, they take it seriously. So when you're doing it, again, we don't own one of those pads yet. We're always careful. We're not going to set it down in gravel and stuff like that. We'll usually leave it in the net. We use these thick rubberized nets. So when it's on there, it's not laying right on the ground. And then we can unhook it, we can hold it, we can take our photo, and we can release it safely. So a net that can handle the weight of a 25, 30-pound carp that you may come across is essential for landing these things. Because beaching them, once you feel the power of these things, beaching them is very rarely an option.
Yeah.
Even when they're tired, you can't turn them very well. But yeah, a wagon, a good chair, a good net, and then a couple other things which make it even more enjoyable overall. Like Jesse says, when you're not watching your rod, you can just enjoy the moment. So there's things called bait alarms. They can either be really annoying if you're with a guy who leaves it on full blast volume and extra high sensitivity, or they can be super, super helpful. And what these do is, instead of just setting your rod on a forked stick, because again, you're just setting it down, waiting for a carp to come bite, you may not cast again for hours. And so you just set your rod down. So instead of just setting in a forked stick, you can get what's called a bait alarm. And so it sets inside of this electronic sensor, and when the line passes through it, it'll start beeping at you. What's awesome about that is you'll have no doubt in your mind when you have a fish or not, because that thing will start screaming at you, and then you get all excited and you go and pick up your rod, and it just pops right out and you start reeling. Yeah. So those things are fantastic. Even it's called a rod pod, where it's a small little fold out thing where it has these special holders for your rod. Again, necessary? No, I still don't have one. I don't use a bait alarm most of the time, But if you are getting into it, by all means, it's something that you can invest a lot of stuff in to have a really cool, fun setup that you are excited about. Yeah. But I wanted this episode to kind of focus on it's not that hard to get into. So like I said, if you have a heavy duty enough rod and you've got a net, a lot of guys already have that rubber bass net that can handle a good size fish. If you take that, you're breaking into your bank for some braid, which you probably already have, to tie some hair rigs with, a $20 pack of tools that comes with everything you need to thread corn onto that hair rig, some good carp hooks, and a couple carp weights. So out the door, you're like $50, and you can go carp fishing with what you have. So that's what's something, Jesse and I, we've been doing it for a few years, and it's one of the things I get most excited about all winter long. And I know like guys have already been doing it for a while now. We've been out a few times by the time you're hearing this episode. But when ice fishing is ending, I am getting really excited for carp fishing. And it sounds weird, but ice fishing is great because you get to just sit on the ice, and some guys find it boring, but you get to sit there, maybe drink a beer, you're talking with your buddies, you're just having fun, relaxing. Carp fishing is the same thing, but with better weather. And that to me is there's no better way to spend, a couple hours after work with a couple friends sitting on the bank, potentially hooking into some, 20 plus pound carp that you get to all be excited with and and experience. So if you haven't done so, I recommend it very highly. Try carp fishing. It's accessible, and again, you're not breaking the bank to get into it.
Yep.
Any last thoughts for anyone trying to get into it, Jesse?
Well, again, you can go crazy into the rabbit hole of carp fishing. And there's so much stuff you can buy, but I think this episode, we really, like Andrew said, we really showed that you don't need anything specialized to get into carp fishing. Once you get into it, if you like it, and I know a lot of people, like you said at the beginning, they're kind of like, it's carp, it's gross, don't want to fish for those. Taken a lot of people carp fishing that had never gone carp fishing before, and they thought it was dumb, and they get hooked. They're like, this is amazing. You're sitting in a lawn chair as the sun's going down, drinking a coffee, talking with your buddies, and all of a sudden your rod starts screaming, and you pick it up and you fight a 25-pound fish.
Yeah.
That doesn't come in like in 8 seconds like a largemouth bass. Like, you're fighting this thing, and it's literally fighting you. It's not just like getting pulled to the boat as it jumps. This thing is like, I'm going this way. And you're like, okay. Like, fights are very good. It's a fantastic sport. And the cool thing is, in Ontario, you can actually use 3 rods now, which is fantastic. Mm-hmm. For many years, you had to use 1. And in the States, you could use 3. In other places, you can even use more than that. But I think for whatever reasons, they had a lot of people coming from England. Because in England, if you catch sometimes like 20 carp a year, that's amazing. Like over there, that's fantastic. Here, you could catch 20 carp in a day. No problem.
The only carp left pretty much out there in Europe are oftentimes in farmed areas. It's like it's a carp, like a stocked pond, right?
Yeah.
And it's purely catch and release, and they literally have these fish named. It's like, oh, that's Big Bertha. We've caught her last year. No, she's this. And they record the weight of it, and they have records of every fish that lives in that pond. Like that's how you do it there. We in Canada have so many carp. And again, we're not talking about invasive carp. We're not talking about the grass carp, stuff like that. We don't want those around. But the common carp, that's what we're talking about catching here. We have so many, and they are accessible and they're fun. And if you go to even just want to see them, if you go to a place like a harbor, you go to pretty much any harbor down by the Toronto Islands, you go out, if you're out at the Coburg Beach, walk by the pier and look down into the water with some polarized glasses, and you'll start seeing these huge fish, big footballs swimming around, and those are carp. They're all over. So we have a great quantity of them. So why not enjoy it?
Yeah. And I think the cool thing about carp fishing too is, like I said, I took my nephew fishing for carp. He was 9. He's 9 years old. We're out fishing, and he's fighting 20-pound carp on carp gear. So I mean, like, he had some advantage there, but he had the time of his life. Like, kids love it. If you want to get your kid, if you have a kid, I don't have kids, but if you do have a kid, you want to get them into fishing. Like, sunfish is great, panfish is great, but carp and catfish is just as good. Throw catfish into the mix too. Use a worm as bait. Carp eat worms too. Cast a worm out and just sit there and let your kid run around and catch frogs and stuff. Who cares? Go out, and then all of a sudden, boom, 15-pound carp. The size of the fish, the kids will blow. It blows their mind. I remember my nephew. I was telling him because he never caught a carp before. And I was like, listen, when this thing hits, it's gonna like pull hard because he's used to catching sunfish, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, okay. He's like, I know. I was like, no, you don't. You don't know. So he had this fish and he had the 9-foot carp rod, the butt of the rod just in his gut. And he's pulling back on this rod. He's like, ah! And he fought that thing for like 15 minutes, finally scooped it in the net. And it was a good fish. It was like maybe 18 to 20 pounds, but he was like, this is insane. It's crazy. I was like, yeah, it's so much fun. So yeah, it's a great thing. And the best time to do it is, in my opinion, is late May into June before it gets too hot. Because the carp are generally, they're done spawning and they're still around. The shallow is still feeding before it gets hot. And then they go a little bit deeper. But it's a great time to do it.
And you're not freezing when you're out there either.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add is make sure with all the other things that you're going to bring bug spray.
Yes.
Because into June, when the mosquitoes come out, you can get eaten alive. It is
wear long
crazy.
Pants. Another tip too. A lot of the places that we go, we find on riverbanks, it's very, very common to have red ants.
Yeah,
like it's infested with them. So wear long pants, tuck them into your socks. Trust me, no one's going to be looking at you funny for having pants tucked into your socks as long as you untuck them by the time you get back to the car. So
Andrew knows he's an expert. He's a fashion expert
in that regard. Yes. So we hope you enjoyed the episode. We have a little bit of housekeeping here. Jesse wants to take care of that as he's so good at housekeeping. He's proven time and time again. He's such a good little housekeeper.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at it. So anyway, we'd like to thank everyone who has left us a recent review. I know we read some reviews last week. We're going to read some more reviews next episode. So if you want us to read your review, make sure you go into Apple and type out a really nice, funny review and we'll read it. We'd like to thank everyone who is a Patreon member who supports the show. Again, there are expenses to the show that we have to pay for every month. So Patreon members are a really cool group of guys and girls that donate a few bucks every month each that help us cover most of the cost for the show. If you'd like to do that, there's a link below. It says support the show. So if you listen to the show every week and you're like, man, I love that show, consider being a Patreon member for $2 a month because it's only 50 cents an episode.
And you're entered into all the giveaways.
Yes. And we have some pretty sick giveaways in June. I'll tell you that. Should I spoil some of the giveaways?
Go for it. At least one. Give one good one.
All right. We have a really cool giveaway and it's, I'm not going to say the brand, but you can figure it out. It's spinner baits.
Ooh.
Which is just in time for bass season. So we got some spinner bait giveaways coming up. We also have another one, which I'm not even going to, I'll mention it. Okay. We have another jig giveaway. So spinner baits and jigs this month. Ooh. You know why? Bass season's coming up. I want to get you guys stocked up for bass season. So here.
Yeah, we try and have the giveaways to be timely for you.
Yeah. It's like, and now the giveaway is ice fishing lures. You can hang on to those for the next 9 months. So anyway, that's all the housekeeping.
So again, thanks everyone for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. And before we go, as tradition states, we're going to have the quote of the week. Lay it on us, Jesse.
All right. So here's the quote of the week. If you ever want to bite when you're fishing, it always happens when this happens. When you take a pee, the carp will grab your bait and flee.